Hey all, welcome back. Week 9, so you're over halfway done. Good job. This week we're going to look at, kind of pick up the pace a little bit. There's a little bit of overlap from last week, just in terms of the time of these events, because we're going to cover through the Civil War and really up to the point of 1906 for the division. And then next week, as we start to engage the scholarship and the outcry of the division and kind of what happens as a result of the division, there'll be some more overlap. So these next few weeks, they're kind of talking about big topics that span large amounts of time. So there's going to be a little bit of back and forth, but that's intentional these next few weeks. Just to give you an overview of what we're looking at this week, I'm going to give you a big picture because I think really you can understand what's happened from this point in history. In just a few sentences, you can understand it. So we'll do that, and then we'll get into the particulars. But it's always nice just to say, okay, this is what you should walk away knowing, and then we'll get into what it looks like. Other denominations during the Civil War, and kind of the Civil War as a theological crisis. Some of the key figures. We'll spend a lot of time looking at some of the big figures, especially figures in the South during the Civil War. And then we'll kind of look at some issues of unity, and then we'll come back to the official division in 1906. And I'm just going to really give you the basic skeleton here. Next week, we'll look at the results of that division and kind of break it down further, what the Church of Christ in the South looked like, what the disciples in the North looked like. This week, I'm just kind of showing you how we got to the point of having a census say two different groups existed instead of one previous to that. All right, let's get into it. So this is the big picture. These are the things that I think if you understand this, you'll grasp what the book and what I am trying to show you through this whole class. I can't emphasize this enough. One of the things that the Civil War showed the New World, what it showed Alexander Campbell, who died in '86, and what it showed the Restoration Movement and people of all over the world, not just in America, was that the New World was not going to be freed or spared from the religious wars of Europe, and not just the wars between the Ottoman Empire and the Christians, or the people in the Byzantine Empire, not even that, but that disunity in Europe that was caused through religious disagreements, or at least in part through religious disagreements, followed the people over who came to the New World. And just because they didn't have a land that was full of history of religious battling amongst Christians, it didn't mean that wasn't going to happen. The Civil War changed how people viewed unity, say it simply. And it was no longer this millennial bringing in and ushering in the kingdom of God. It was, okay, we've got a bigger problem on our hands. America is not going to bring the type of unity, at least not immediately, that we expected it would. And as reflected, it's going to move on to the second point, of every denomination, and we're not just talking, the bigger ones like the Methodists and Presbyterians, but or the Baptists, but every denomination apart from the Congregationalists split during the Civil War. And really, the Congregationalists, they didn't split during the Civil War because they didn't have as much of a kind of a unifying voice like everyone else did. And maybe you can throw in the Restoration Movement here, and we'll come back to that later in this lecture. But basically, take an organization, let's say the Baptists, and you can say and identify clearly, this is the group that supported the Confederacy or the South. And so in the South, that's how you get the Southern Baptist Convention. Okay, they started as a result of siding with the South. And in the 1990s, made a public apology for siding with slavery, and they've had a lot of good follow through from that. But just to show you the big picture here is that they all split. why do we say, or why does Mark Noll make popular the idea that the Civil War in America was a religious war? Well, because the thing that's most clearly identified across the board is that these people who were a part of the same church before split right before and during it. And I think it's correct to say, as Mark Noll has almost single-handedly popularized in the last 2 decades, that the Civil War had an element of religious war with it. And so we're not immune to religious wars. So kind of this third point, going to the restoration side of things, this is, everyone involved, but the restoration side of things, this is pretty typical, but it's not universal, that those in the South were against societies, so like the American Christian Missionary Society or the Women's Board Missionary Society or any of others, the Bible handout groups that existed. Typically those in the South were against them because of the fear of a organization existing that was not talked about in Scripture, and they were opposed to musical instruments. So that's how the South usually focuses on things. And this became amplified when the American Christian Missionary Society, the ACMS, started taking positions in favor of the Union. And in fact, when the South hears about these positions in favor of the Union, many of the people in the churches who were pacifists, or at least leaned towards pacifism, wouldn't join the Confederacy directly as a result. And the fear is that if you form an organization, even if it's, by all accounts, a great organization of wanting to evangelize the lost people, it's a pretty good existing reason. Even if you have that, the fear is if you start an organization, they'll take theological positions, and those positions, because of their authority being backed by more than one congregation, will become authoritative. And that's the danger that the South saw with them. And that's exactly what happened within, a few decades of these organizations existing. So at the South, this is kind of the follow-up, through the war, they became very poor compared to the North. And not by a little bit. Most of the wealthy in the South moved up north. They lost a majority of their trade with the old world. And when you crush the slave market, as many people feared, and even though it was a great thing, when you crush the slave market, you're going to disrupt the flow of money just vastly. And anytime you lose a war, the financial situation afterwards is never pleasant. So the South becomes increasingly poor. That affects the use of churches. Proportionally, the North at this point, they have about 75 people per congregation, while the South, they're not building new buildings, and they're meeting in larger groups as a result of that. Okay, so the official split 1906. That's because the National Census started as an actual organization in 1902, and following up with David Lipscomb and official information published in 1906 that a division had happened. This doesn't mean that it took place in 1906, but it was reflected in 1906. This final point, this is just something that your book mentions, but others have mentioned it before. And I think if you grasp this part right here, you can see why what we're going to talk about and who we're going to talk about is so important. That if you face, say, the Catholic Church in this time, the reason why Alexander Campbell dated the Bishop of Cincinnati was because bishops, both in the present and historically, have been kind of the leading voices of an area by design for a church. And so in the Restoration movement, because there were no bishops, because there were no unifying voices, and you can't just call in your bishop to settle theological disputes. What do? Well, you have an editor, and you write in questions, and they publish positions. So in practice, no, the Restoration Movement did not have bishops. What they did have, though, was several editors who, through mostly Alexander Campbell up until the 1850s, when he stopped writing so much because he was getting older, and then other people replacing him, and it's been the case like that for a long time, that editors were the theological voices that you asked questions for, and once it was in print and distributed to thousands of people, that's as much of a unifying voice as you're going to get. So editors kind of replacing the idea of bishops. So these are the big picture things. And I think if you really latch on to any one thing about the Restoration Movement, it's the split between the South and the North. But the South, through lots of variables, were kind of more of a strict approach to the scriptures, and therefore they did not allow things that were questionable in terms of societies and music. Okay, moving on here. So just a map, just because I love showing maps, because I always pull these up whenever I'm thinking of them. I don't know how many times I've looked at these, but they always help in terms of picturing what's going on. So remember, this is where Alexander Campbell's living, in this kind of border state area in between Ohio and Pennsylvania. And if you look at the Restoration Movement, the places they're biggest right now, so Kentucky, Missouri, Moses Lard, one of the figures we'll learn about, is here in Missouri, and he has to flee to Canada to avoid fighting in the war, and then he comes back. Pardee Butler in Kansas, Stone here in Kentucky, and Campbell here. If you kind of approach it all the way across the border states, the leading figures of the movement were really on the border. So you can see why the North and the South could so easily divide the movement, because people were hearing the conflicts that were going around them quite a bit. It wasn't just some localized organization in Alabama or something. They were spread out across the border, and I think that's reflective of just how much the Civil War was able to divide an organization that didn't have a clear top-down unity. Okay. All right. This is one of the, I think, probably the most famous of the things to highlight. I mean, almost every book in the Restoration Movement talks about this, and it proves a point. After the war, so this is taking place in 1872, and what happens is, because the North is more wealthy, they start using what people of the day called the more sophisticated methods. What did that mean? Well, it meant, generally speaking, that even though the North was theologically very conservative in the Restoration Movement, it's been summarized this way: they were liberal in their methods for practice. So while they were strict in theological claims, they would allow instruments, they would allow local preachers, they would allow or paid ministers, they would allow expensive buildings and so forth. While in the South, there was much more of an opposition to those things, even though they were the same sort of theological conservative voices. Both sides at this point in the movement are theologically conservative. Now, when we get to the North later on, there'll be another split in the North between the disciples and the Christian church. And that's over liberal theology. That's over kind of an appeal towards that. But what's going on right here is not so much theological differences, but it's a distinction of practice. So in the North, they're so much wealthier. And as a result, they're able to pay for instruments. They're able to pay for local ministers. It's much easier to be in favor of a local minister if you're able to pay them. So that's how just in practice, that's what's happening. And at this point, so at least in 1906, there's roughly 7,800 different church buildings in the north. So, subtract a considerable amount of that, and in 1872, for one church building in Cincinnati, so it's an expensive area, to raise $140,000 for just the building and $80,000 for the organ. So I want you to picture this. You're in the South and you are struggling to provide money to pay to the poor. And you hear that up north, those people that you are disagreeing with on the use of instruments spent $8,000 on an organ. You could see why that would kind of push division a bit further. Money always gets messy whenever you're talking about organizations who are trying to help the poor versus spending it on things that are maybe not for the poor. Of course, keep in mind though that it was Judas who first opposed the pouring of the expensive ointment on Jesus' feet and said, we could have sold this and give the money to the poor. And it's not always clear how you spend your money. But nonetheless, that's not for me to decide right here. That is what's happening in the South. And so Benjamin Franklin, not the Benjamin Franklin that everyone knows about, but the Benjamin Franklin of the Restoration Movement, he kind of tells people about this in the South, and they don't enjoy that. And they're struggling to make even $100,000 amongst all the churches to help the poor. So one church, $140,000, no problem. All the churches in the South struggling to make $100,000 to help the poor. So that's the reality of part of the division that's being kind of just spread open right now. And one of the things I've only recently come across, this is from reading David Lipscomb. David Lipscomb, when he's talking about the use of hymnals and contrasting them between the North and the South, there was a hymnal that came out pretty far into the Civil War, and the North, even though it was more wealthy because they were more educated and they had better schools, they were using sophisticated language. That's what David Lipscomb called it, and he was worried that people in the South wouldn't be able to understand it. And so he wrote something very telling about this, and he was very honest. And given the good that he did, I think it's fair to appreciate what he's saying. He says that not only was it hard to read for many of the working class, and not because he himself struggled, he was a fantastic scholar, and we'll get to him here in a minute, but if people in the South are struggling to read it, and David Lipscomb says, and not only that, but the books are stained with the blood of those who killed the people in our states. So, there was a little bit of hard feelings after the war. And you're talking about a war where over 700,000 people died. More people died in the North than the South, but, over 300,000 people died in the South. They lost. And as a result of that, a lot of the money went away. And now you're publishing a book that the wealthy can understand better than the Southerners. So there's some opposition there. And this is all just, highlighting the same problem, but I think you should be able to see the point being made, I think. All right. Talbert Fanning, kind of get into some of the Southern, especially theologically minded editors, or shall we call them the bishops of the Restoration Movement. He founds the Gospel Advocate that will still be used in one form of another all the way till today, through David Lipscomb University, where the editors of that sort of shaped a majority view of, and or reflected the majority view of the Southern, becomes the most important unifying voice in the South. And especially for amongst people who, didn't have access to the many publications that were existing in the North. This was a big deal for them. He was vocally against society, so again, that's that Southern appeal to no societies, no instruments, no paid local ministers, kind of three unifying factors of the South there. And he founded Franklin College, which eventually would have David Lipscomb. David Lipscomb would found his own college, which after his death in 1917 would become David Lipscomb University. And the long story short is what this man started eventually becomes what is certainly one of the largest Restoration Movement colleges that exist today. They have about 5,000 students of undergrad through grad school. And if you go there, they have a rich heritage that traces back, and some of the buildings that they have, some of the memoirs that they have trace back to figures like this because he taught David Lipscomb. But I thought I'd mention him just because he's a second generation Restoration Movement figure who really enters the scene after these theological problems are existing. And he starts to provide a voice for the people in the South who did not have one previously. Okay. All right. Get to the man himself, David Lipscomb. He didn't just support the freeing of slaves. His family at one point, when he was a small child, they moved to the North so that they could legally free their own slaves. It had a profound influence on him. And then when he goes back, he starts advocating for the same thing. And he also opposed governmental involvement. And for a Southerner to do this was interesting because he's in the South advocating for the freedom of slaves, and he does have some confusing statements on that, just to be open with you. But in the South, he's advocating freedom of slaves, but he's also advocating, for less and less governmental involvement. And so it's been characterized, correctly or not, as sort of a Mennonite approach to the government, where he really pushes that not just in battle, in terms of pacifism, but in terms of government officials, that the church and the kingdom of God is something totally separate than the rest of the world has. I listened in years ago. I attended the Stone Campbell Journal Conference, and there was a paper presented that talked about David Lipscomb, and what the paper argued for was that the majority view of the Restoration Movement was pacifism at the time of the Civil War. And then afterwards, someone came up and talked to the guy who presented the paper and said, that's true amongst the leaders, that a majority of the leaders, it seems, were not really in favor of the war, but most of the people, the actual people, and not just the leaders, were involved in the war itself. And so while I'll highlight a lot of pacifists as we kind of move forward, keep in mind that these are just the individuals. Just because you're in the South and just because you're a hearer of the gospel advocate, it doesn't mean that you're a pacifist. Most of the people in the South in the Restoration Movement were not pacifists, even though many of their leaders were. Okay, but that's a side note. I have been to David Lipscomb's house. So the Nashville Bible School that eventually becomes David Lipscomb University, it started, in his house and by his house. So I've actually had a meal at his dining room table. It was a fun trip to be able to experience. One of the things that was stressed as you kind of walk around the house and you see all of his stuff in his house is how much of a scholar he was. And we're not talking about, as much as the South may not have been as wealthy, there were still many people who were studying on a high academic level for their day. And that's their legacy up to the point of still providing doctoral degrees at David Lipscomb University. So that's part of his life. The main reason I want to highlight him, though, is because he's the one that would make kind of the official statement that when the census is being done in America, they ask him if the North and the South should be classified as two different groups. And he says in 1906 that they should, and comes under fire under that. But again, that's a lot for next week. So that's a little bit about him. The traditions that follow from him, I'll reference a few more in the coming weeks. But the big thing you need to kind of see from him is in the South, it's publishing the Gospel Advocate. And it's because of that, and especially after David Lipscomb takes over as the only editor for a short time, that the numbers of publications that are received from him just go astronomically high. Okay. He does write also, if you're interested, you can find it free online. He writes an 80-page book on how to correctly interpret Scripture that becomes kind of a standard for some of the members associated with him. All right. I want to share this quote. This is quite late, 1899. This reflects, though, I think, all that the South had problems with the North. So we'll just read it and I'll discuss it. So speaking in reference to instruments, and you could fill this in with societies. I mean, those two issues especially were big problems. And this is the same theological problem they had with both. It says, neither Paul nor any of the other apostle, nor the Lord Jesus, nor any of the disciples for 500 years used instruments. It seems there cannot be a doubt that the use of instrumental music in connection with the worship of God, whether used as part of a worship or as an attraction, accompaniment, is authorized by God. And, this is the important part, it violates the oft-repeated prohibition to add nothing to, take nothing from, the commandments of the Lord. It might seem strange, to make such a big deal out of the use of instruments or such a big deal out of societies. But you always, whenever you're approaching these things, and you can't understand it within their own framework of mind, you just think it's ridiculous, it probably means you're missing something. So you always need to be asking, okay, for the people advocating against the use of instruments, what is it that's connected to that's so vital and so foundational and essential? And in the case of the South, the Churches of Christ or Churches of God, the use of instruments and societies was more than just those two topics, but it was adding to the Word of God. Now, whether you agree with that it does or doesn't, that's not the point. What I want you to see is the reason behind those strong positions was because it was connected to the Scriptures. And really, we can only understand those positions if you see it in connection to the bigger problem, which is, how do you interpret the Scriptures? And can you add something to it? Or does the ignoring of a topic, like societies, mean that it's prohibited or that it's okay? And that is not, at least at this point in the movement, that's not a clear and decided issue. So that sums up, I think, that's why I shared it, what's going on here. All right, get into the best of all the beards in the Restoration movement, Moses Lard. Man, 12 years ago, was it? Or even further than that now. When I was passing, I was in a library at Restoration Movement College, and I was passing by, pictures and memoirs of figures from the Restoration Movement, and a friend and I just started judging people by their facial hair, and we got to Moses Lard, and we thought, man, he wins. Because I don't know if you can't tell very well from this picture, but he's only got the neck beard, and so if you can pull that off, you go for it. I'm all in favor of that. More importantly, though, just putting that aside, he's a great author and in many ways, in some ways, a hero during this time. Not only did he, personally know Alexander Campbell, and in fact, Alexander Campbell, towards the end of his life, when someone asked to debate him, he said, well, why don't you just debate one of my best students, Moses Lard? And Moses Lard, in the eyes of Alexander Campbell, was one of the most promising figures of the movement. And he wrote, one of the things he wrote that I've read that I've really enjoyed is he wrote a really good Romans commentary. And it shows the strong contrast that the Restoration movement had honestly, with the Presbyterians at this time in issues of Romans 9 and 10 especially. But that's details we don't need to get into. But he also published Lard's Quarterly. This is one of the things that I've spent some time in as well. It's a 5-volume series that talks more than any other literature that I'm familiar with about the nature of Christian unity. And I'll share one of those here in just a minute. But he's also a pacifist. So I mentioned that, if you remember back to the map, he left Missouri, moved to Canada so he can avoid fighting. So he held his convictions and put his money where his mouth is. He did publish the Apostolic Times, but again, that only lasted a year. So not as vital. And then in 1866, so right at the height of all of the controversy of the Civil War, at least theologically speaking, he drew a distinction between two things here. And I want to land in on this for a minute, because it brings up a serious question about the nature of disunity. So he draws a difference, and I'll try to hide what I think of this, because I don't want to influence it too much just yet. I want to hear what you all have to say on the forums about this. But he just draws a distinction between the departure, those who leave the faith, and divisions, Christians who break off and remain Christians. So on one hand, you have what he would say are those who no longer follow Christian doctrine and are therefore no longer part of the church, and those who are Christians who no longer associate and have fellowship with, in the same way they used to, other Christians. Now, what this does, whether we realize it or not, whether he realized it or not, what this does is it raises the question, okay, could you call any division, if you wanted to, a departure, where if people disagreed with you, they're no longer a part of any church? So it can kind of create even though it was kind of a nasty word at this time to throw around, it can create the sectarian mindset where you start calling other Christians who left you because they have different opinions no longer Christians. And if you push this further and further, it gets to the point where, well, if someone doesn't fully agree with me, they're not actually Christians, just not associated with us. They're just not Christians. And so what do you call those who split off from you? It raises bigger questions about the nature of disunity that I want us to wrestle with. And here in a minute, we'll do that even further. But that becomes kind of a part of the foundation of the eventual division, where it becomes, in practice, possible to see yourself as separate from the North and from the South. So that's the seed of disunity that's kind of planted there. And not because he's advocating disunity. I don't want to give this man kind of a bad taste in your mouth. He advocated for Christian unity in a lot of ways. And anyone who reads his material knows that immediately. Okay, Pardee Butler, one of the heroes. I didn't highlight him last year just because I wanted to focus in this year more on, or last week, but this week more on the Civil War and the events that took place around him. It didn't start the Civil War, but it was kind of the last straw before the Civil War really started. So Pardee Butler is a staunch abolitionist, meaning he was for the freedom of slaves. And he was extremely vocal about it, both from the pulpit and going around and finding arguments with people. So in Kansas, which his ancestors still own the same land in Kansas, and they own, in theory, and it's hard to find true information on this, just to be open, but they own this flag. Now, this flag is created in opposition to him. The story is, and this much of it is pretty confident, is that he started vocalizing some opinions about the freedom of slavery, and some pro-slavery Christians took him and put him on a raft on a river, and he can't swim, and they put this flag on the raft and sent him down river. And evidently, he, however much of this is true, it's hard to tell, but he gives this long speech as he's pushed off that he regrets nothing, and because he holds to his convictions that people are created equal. And the rest of the story is that he breaks the flag down and uses it as an oar down the river to get to the shore, and he lives. That's why his ancestors are alive. But it does show you that, some Christians in the Restoration movement were making a big deal out of the fact that they were for the freedom of slaves. You can never get all of your virtues just from one person. There's an old saying in the church, and this traces back to Anthony of the Desert Fathers in roughly 325. Anthony goes and he says that if you are a bee, you don't gather the nectar or the pollen from one flower, but you go and you get the virtues from all of the flowers. And what his point was is that in the Church of God, you don't just learn all of your virtues from one person. You don't pick the thorns of their life. You pick what's good from them. And if you've noticed in the Restoration movement at this point, everyone has had major flaws, just like you and me. And what I'm inviting you to do is to look at figures like this, who held convictions about the equality of God's children so strongly that he was willing to be tarred and feathered, sent upstream, whatever it might be. He held his convictions about the equality of people strong enough to act on it. And to say it one way, faith is always the visible living of invisible realities. And I think this man expresses that well. So all that to say, this is the good part of this part of the Restoration movement, in my opinion. Okay, so just to get into a practical question of unity, if you've noticed at this point in the semester, we've really been diving into questions about, okay, what does unity look like? Well, this one's, I think, very direct and personal, and it's a question of practice. And I'll give you a non-hypothetical example of this here in a moment. So here's the question for us. To what extent should churches base their practices around not offending their brother? So 1 Corinthians 8, and you can see the same thing in Romans. In 1 Corinthians 8, Paul says, if eating meat offends my brother, I'll never eat meat again. Because this whole controversy was, if I eat meat and it causes my brother to stumble, maybe because they used to eat that meat as a sacrifice, as part of a continuing sacrifice to an idol, or so forth. So he doesn't want to cause his weaker brother to stumble, so he decides not to eat it if it helps his brother not stumble. Okay, that's the thought behind it. In practical terms, for us, maybe it's, do I have to dress a certain way on Sunday morning to cause a brother not to stumble? Or do I have to not have paintings of ancient saints up in my office to help a brother not to stumble? Or do I have to not make the sign of the cross to cause my brother not to stumble? Those are not hypotheticals. I have in my office what are typically called icons, just the Greek word for image, of, a dozen or so Christians who've been alive, and I have them of people throughout the whole history of the church. I mean, starting from the 2nd century, I have one of Irenaeus up through Gregory Palamas and Thomas Aquinas and others, even people in the Restoration movement, who parts of their life I admire. And years ago, I had someone who came into my office and was, deeply offended that I would have something like that in my office. Now, I think I'm completely free to do so in Christ, but does that mean that I don't do something in order to not offend them? And this, I think, this next point that I'm going to say is where it gets quite difficult to discern. If the practice itself is not essential to the faith, to what extent should I sacrifice it to not offend someone? Now, I've heard different rules for answering this question. Years ago, I think, when I first really asked this question, and probably to a lesser extent, one of the mentors in my life at the time, he answered with, well, you should always ask yourself, are you dealing with a weaker brother or are you dealing with a dictator? And that should suffice to figure out what you really should do. But in the context of Isaac Errett, and many in the South, there was the position that was being held that, maybe instruments aren't sinful in worship, but if it's causing division that some of us are using them, wouldn't it be better, and he uses the word harmony, wouldn't it be better to keep harmony and nobody use instruments in worship at this point? Only about 50 congregations in total were using instruments. And the basic idea is, well, if we really believe the instrument is not an essential part of the faith, then why would we hold on to something that is not essential at the cost of losing something that is essential? Unity. Let me try to rephrase this a bunch of different ways so we can all understand this. Why would I keep something that I could give up if I lose something that I should never give up? My brothers and sisters. So that's the question that's going on. And I think that there is some merit to that. But I think in reality, what are you going to do in a church that's not going to offend someone? And I just have to be open with my own opinion on this, and I'll be open about this one. It's much more of a murky water territory, a gray area, in discerning exactly when it is good to pick a battle and when it is good to give something up. I mentioned a moment ago making the sign of the cross. In my own private life, I do that when I pray. And I just ask the Lord to, I thank him for coming down, and I ask him to find me on his right and not on his left on that day. But I made the decision years ago to not do that in public because I found it to be more distracting than helpful. And so I just do it in my mind. But to what extent do you not do something just at the risk of fearing someone else? You could choose this with alcohol. You could choose this with whatever. How do you discern what practices that you are able to give up are worth holding on to? So I'll just leave you with that one, and maybe that's something you can write about in your forum, because that does, in practice, that's how a lot of divisions happen. People hold on to something that they could have given up because they don't think they needed to or should have given it up in the minute. Okay. And specifically with Isaac Errett, is he correct in advocating for not using instruments to not offend anyone? That's his position. And just about everyone disagreed with him on that. Okay, so this is the official division that takes place. So this is the census of 1906, and you can see where the cracks of disunity existed long before this. And again, books exist advocating that the division was prevalent long before, and I think they're largely correct. David Lipscomb, just to show you the full circle of what happened here, he attended the American Christian Missionary Society, one of their conventions, and at that convention he came back and wrote, we're all united still. The North and South are still united. So much so that even Moses Lard, after the war, is able to say, we did not divide over the war. So that's where they start. So even after the war, the division is not clearly there. But by 1906, after years of more publishing these points, the strained relationship never truly mended. And things that were put on the back burner, like instruments or like organizations and paid local ministers, they became focal points. And those focal points became louder than what united them. And anytime you end up really advocating more for why your side is right and theirs is wrong instead of what you're agreeing on, you're not moving towards necessarily Christian unity, at least not in my opinion. So David Lipscomb, he affirmed, he did not seek out to do this, as he makes clear in his writings to all of those who are against him. He affirms that the churches of Christ should be considered a separate religious group from the disciples in the North. So, big thing to remember from this. After 1906, officially, the North and the South, even though there's still some relationship there and there's some common heritage, even though officially they were divided, they're broken up into two groups. And so moving forward, we're kind of thinking about in the Restoration Movement, those in the South and those in the North, but I probably won't refer to them as those as much. I'll refer to them as the disciples and the Church of Christ. So those are the two groups you have right now. Now, eventually in the North, the disciples will split again. And even in the South, there's kind of three branches of the Churches of Christ. And I'll look at those next week, and we'll walk through that. But right here, you just need to see there's two big groups formed. And this reflected the disunity that already was there. I do think it's interesting, the census data, I'm surprised your book didn't have this. The census data that was kind of reflected in the reason why there was two groups sought after was that the North had a considerable amount of more people than the South did. So they're more successful in the North. And I think some of the bigger states of the Christian church in particular, like Ohio or Illinois or even Missouri to some extent, some of the longest lasting Christian churches exist there, kind of trace their origin back to this time period when the Restoration Movement was growing. There's some data that would suggest in the 19th century that the Christian church was the disciples was the fastest growing Christian religious body of the 19th century. Now that kind of excludes Catholic immigration because so many Catholics are immigrating during this time. I'll share some numbers with this in the future, but so many Catholics are immigrating during this time that by the time of the Second World War, Catholics were fighting with Protestants in a non-religious war, or at least not as openly religious war. And so Catholics and Protestants ceased to have as much tension. And part of it's because of all the immigration. But the bigger point here is that, in a time frame when America is booming with different religious groups. The Restoration movement actually picks up as the fastest growing one. And it makes some sense. They're trying to unify. Some organizations join them. But by the 1906, this is the data. So they have a total of over 1.1 million if you include some of the outskirts that aren't included there. And also just to note that the blacks, and this, I'm only recording this because this was in the census data, were pretty evenly dispersed amongst the two. So it's not as if the North, proportionally speaking, had a stronger opinion and freedom for blacks as the South did. They both kind of had the same, proportionally speaking, at that time. Okay, well, that's it for this week. There's some dark moments in our history. There are some heroes. There are some great things said. But I think the things that we should wrestle with as a result of this on Christian unity is, given that this is how disunity was born, what does that mean about our protection as a safeguard to disunity in the future? And so that's why I asked the questions that I did this week. And as we move forward into next week into higher education and liberalism and break down the division even more, we'll get into some other things that come up when it comes to unity that we need to wrestle with. But this week, the bigger one is kind of safeguarding ourselves in practice, asking what are we willing to give up and what's worth fighting for. Because I think those are the bigger questions of this day that we can learn from them. All right, that's it for this week. God bless you all, and excited to be back for the second section of our semester.